this tonight. This tonight.
Okay, good. Thanks, Steve, and hello to everyone who's joining us. What I will plan to do this evening is to share some information about the grading process, more on the background of why we're doing this and some of the background on what's happening when we're doing the grading. Less obviously on the hands-on use of the equipment, which is better done in one of the grading workshops that Steve has operated around the state. We'll touch on some pieces of research, of course, but I would like to expose some aspects of grading that you may not have thought about as part of the standard grading process. So what we have on the first slide is a sugar maker up in Lewis County at one of Steve's workshops a couple years ago now, I think, practicing his grading techniques as others in the workshop are doing. And you see in front of him some equipment that should be familiar to most of you or all of you, and maybe some things that are not so familiar. Most of you are using the hydrometer to measure density. I don't know, I don't have those data up anymore, but I'm not sure many of you are using the Hanna meter, which is the blue item on the table. We have a little Vermont kit for color, but what are those little plastic cups sitting around the table? What's happening with those? One of the points I want to make with this slide of Henry Marcus from Vermont doing some syrup testing is one of the easiest ways to check your grading practices and also to check your grading equipment is to participate in maple contests. And this is Henry out in at the Ohio meetings a couple years ago now participating in their syrup grading contest or syrup contest and doing some basic testing of the syrups, particularly for density, and he has a thermometer there to with a refractometer to check what the syrup temperature is and a color kit, and you can see some of the other equipment. But when you're putting your syrup in against others and subjecting it to people who are professional graders such as Henry, then and your results, let's say, were different than his results, you get a clue as to maybe something that may be going wrong there. We had that experience with our Arnott syrups a few years ago where we discovered that our hydrometer was not calibrated properly, and we were getting syrups that I think were a little too heavy and essentially giving away some syrup or some sugar in the process. So think about participating in some of these syrup contests to check your grading skill. I also make the point generally, and I'll make this several times during the talk, is that the grading is actually more difficult than most of us believe. The techniques and care that you have to use for the equipment are something that I think many sugar makers don't pay enough attention to. In the Quebec market, all of the grading for the syrup that they market is done centrally through a lab that's contracted for that purpose. So they have people there who are full-time trained in how to use the equipment, they maintain the equipment, and they can get pretty accurate grading evaluations out of the syrups that they're marketing. Okay, so here are some of the elements of grading. And I put flavor first because, in fact, in my view, it is the most important and sometimes the least attended to aspects of the grading process. We're selling the syrup for its flavor, and it will pay us to pay more attention to whether the flavor is up to standards, particularly looking for off flavors and other things that would cause customer dissatisfaction or customer satisfaction. And I'll be touching a little bit more about the elements of flavor testing later in the presentation. The ones that we think mostly about are density, color, clarity, and these are part of the official requirements for both the federal requirements and the state requirements for syrup quality. So, and flavor is part of that too. So you cannot market off-flavored syrup. The syrup has to have a characteristic maple flavor to it. But there are specific density standards. There are specific color requirements and requirements for clarity of the syrup that are part of the New York regulations. One thing that Steve is emphasizing, one measurement that Steve is emphasizing in his workshops is measuring invert sugar. Now, this will apply to not all of you, but anyone who is going to be using their syrup for maple products, that is, they're going to be concentrating the sugar further and turning it into cream, candy, or granulated sugar, ought to be measuring the invert sugar in the syrup when it's put into the barrel, so that you have a sense of what the potential of that barreled syrup is for producing these products before you actually commit yourself to using it for those products. The actual role of invert sugar in the crystallization process is something that's beyond the purpose of tonight's presentation, but Steve is training people how to use these diabetic meters to measure the invert sugar in syrups as a way to index what your invert sugar concentration is. So it's something to think about for those of you who are looking at using your syrups for sugars and other advanced products. Okay, starting with density. So all of you should know, at least those of you who have been producing maple products should know that there are required density intervals for syrup sold to the consumers or syrups marketed. It's a fairly narrow density range. It's what, 66, 68% sugar in that range. And so I have the question here is, why does density matter? What are we trying to achieve by having this density matter? Unfortunately, I can't actually interact with you the way I'd like to and sort of have a conversation on this issue. So I'll just give you the answers. Whoops. Which I should do now. So the reason that density matters, there are several reasons density matters. First of all, it is part of the flavor profile. And I notice there's some questions popping up here. I will answer these periodically as I reach a point of several questions. But so one of the things is that the mouth, what's called the mouthfeel of the syrup, is very sensitive to the density of the syrup. If you get much below 66%, the syrup is going to feel very watery in the mouth. It's not going to have the syrupy consistency that one expects out of a maple syrup. The second aspect of density that matters is that if you get the density too high, you reach into the crystallization range of sugar densities. And in fact, the upper limit of the official density is about at the point where you can, if you go past that, you're going to start getting crystals in your syrup, which has a quality impact, but also you're giving away sugar. So all the sugar that's crystallizing is sugar that you should have had at a somewhat more dilute concentration and got some money off of it. So the crystallization process is part of the reason that there's an upper limit on the density. The third reason is that the sugar density is really important in controlling microorganism growth in the syrups. So what is reflected by sugar density is the absence of water. So when you have 66% sugar, you have 34% water, and that low water concentration makes it hard for microorganisms to grow. So you should pay attention to the density for those three reasons. Let's see, Steve, looks like you're answering some of these questions as a sidebar. So let's see, did you answer them all here? What is meant by clarity? Yeah.
I'll try not to be distracting here, Brian.
Okay, yeah, so Steve does have guidelines on using the invert meter, and it's actually really helpful to go through the workshop with him because it's something that is easier to demonstrate than it is to actually explain. Most of you are using hydrometers for density tools. So you see a hydrometer in this picture. You see two different kinds of refractometers, and we didn't ask you to separate which of them you're using. There is the optical refractometer, where they're all actually optical in a sense, but there's one where you have to use your eye to figure out where that little line is in the prism. And the MISCO is an electronic refractometer that also uses the same kind of optical properties of a solution, but has electronic means of sensing the amount of sugar. Some of you indicated that you're using a thermometer for measuring density. You can't do that. So I'm not sure what is happening there. You can do it if you're in a physics lab and you sort of do the basics of density, but measuring volume and temperatures and so forth. But a point to be made is that you always need to use a thermometer when you're doing, you always need to pay attention to temperature when you're measuring densities. Because the density is very sensitive to the temperature of the fluid. So all of you who are using hydrometers should also be measuring temperatures, as Henry Marcus was doing in an earlier slide. Temperatures are also important with respect to the what I'll call the manual refractometer, the one you look through, and also electronic refractometers. In both cases, the density is still very sensitive to temperature. All of the electronic refractometers have a temperature compensation built into the electronics, but those compensation mechanisms only work within a range of temperatures, so they don't work at the extremes of temperature, such as a freezing cold sugar house or a syrup fresh off of the evaporator is beyond the range of these pieces of equipment. And if you try it on, particularly the hot syrup on a MISCO refractometer, it will give you a message saying it's out of range. But some of the others don't do that, and the manual refractometers, some of them have a built-in optomechanical temperature compensation, but many of them don't. And so you should know, first of all, whether your refractometer has a temperature compensation built in, and then what its range, and if it has that built-in compensation, what its ranges are, so that you're measuring the density within the ranges for which that piece of equipment is designed. In some ways, the hydrometer is a little bit more straightforward because you actually must use the temperature and a chart to figure out what correction you apply to that. So let me see here. What do we? Okay, so we have some more notes from Steve here. Okay, and one of the points I also want to make here is that all of these are really pretty sensitive pieces of equipment. You need to treat them carefully. Don't just sort of leave your hydrometer sitting around, letting it accumulate crystallized sugar on the outside, letting it stay dirty. The hydrometer is calibrated in a clean condition, and if it has its own weight of crystal sugar or something else adhering to the hydrometer, it's going to throw off that calibration. A common problem, and the one that I think we had at the Arnott situation, is that through use, the little paper piece inside the neck can move around, and if you're not really gentle with that, it can start dropping to the bottom, and you can get out of range of accuracy. The same thing is true of the manual refractometers and the electronic refractometers. They require a fair amount of care to keep them clean, keep the prisms clean and polished, and to be tested regularly, at least annually, to make sure they're still giving you the numbers that you expect them to give you. Okay, so now for color grading. Okay, so there's a question about a preferred method. I think just washing it off with hot water is a good way. It's probably better to leave it in a little container of water so that the sugar will be dissolved off of it. You can keep it in warm water so that the hydrometer is at temperature. It's not going to change the temperature of the syrups very much. But mostly just paying attention to having it clean and better to dry it off. So again, you're not adding any adhering liquid, but if you're dealing it in a hydrometer cup, the volume of the syrup is much greater than any film that you might have on the hydrometer. So that's probably not a big problem. Okay, so color grading. The point I want to make here is that it's a bit more complex than most people believe, and we'll illustrate some of this complexity in the next series of slides. So why do we color grade? Any thoughts there? Think about that a little bit. Well, the main reason, is it required? Sort of. It is definitely required if you put a color on your syrup. However, if you read the New York law carefully, you're not required to put a color on your syrup. You have to grade the syrup A and B, and you use color generally to separate those grades. But the light amber, medium amber, dark amber is not a required part of the label. If you do put those designations, they need to be measured and accurate. Mostly we use color because we feel it's a substitute for flavor, and in some general way it is. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes, but we try to use color as a guideline for the consumer to give them an idea of the flavor intensity that they're likely to experience. And in general terms, that probably works out pretty well, but there are cases where it doesn't work out so well. But that's the main reason that we want to put flavor, the color on the syrup. And some of you are aware that the International Maple Syrup Institute is advocating a different set of labels, both a different range, a different way to grade syrup in terms of its color, and a different set of descriptors to more directly relate to the flavor than color does. So some of you know about that, and we'll just see how that's been unfolding for 5 or more years now. It remains to be seen whether it'll ever happen, but in any case, there is a group within the maple business that is looking at changing some of these flavor designations. Okay, one of the important points that I think many producers don't understand is that flavor and color change continuously. So the process that is used in the evaporator with heat and the syrup chemistry to produce color and to produce the flavors, because these are heat-induced chemical changes. Those processes actually continue to happen after the syrup is put in the drums or after the syrup is put in bottles. So syrup that sits around for a long period of time, and hopefully most of it doesn't, get sold and used pretty quickly. But syrup that is kept for years will continue to darken and continue to develop a more intense flavor because the chemical processes will still occur unless you put the syrup under nitrogen or some very low temperature to slow down these change processes. So these color changes are continuous after production. Here are some of the different pieces of equipment that you're using. Most of you seem to be using the Vermont kit and color graders or visual graders more so than the Hanna meters. But we have the old Berliner tester that is no longer available. We have the old USDA kit, some other older kits, and the Lovabond instrument is that sort of dark blocky thing perched on in the back there. Okay, and here's a couple of different Hannameters. And what I'll be describing in the next couple of slides is some experiments that Steve and I did a couple years ago to evaluate the effectiveness of these different methods of color grading syrups. So the color grading of syrup in the U.S. uses the USDA visual reference as the standard. And that's true in New York too. So if you read the New York laws, you are supposed to be using the USDA visual reference kit. This used to be a kit that had permanent colored glass as the color standard. The new USDA kits have plastic color standards. So these are little removable pieces of plastic with different colors in them. The Vermont kit, which is actually the most common color kit used, is really a secondary standard in the U.S. It actually works pretty well, as I'll show you in a few minutes, but it isn't the primary standard. It isn't the one that we're supposed to be using. The Hannameter is, again, a substitute for this. This is a meter that uses electronics and light beams and spectrophotometry to measure the density, the color density of the syrup around a narrow wavelength. So when you're looking, rather than what you're using with your eyes, which is a broad set of wavelengths, the Hannameter uses a very narrow wave band to look at the color grade of the syrup. And it is the way grading is done in Canada, but it's not the way grading, it's not the standard for the US. And there are problems with the Hannameter and the Canadian transmission grades matching to the visual grades that the US uses. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. Yeah, we're seeing some good advice on the side here about having multiple hydrometers. You need one because they do break, of course. In fact, you probably need several at the start of the season. And but it's a really good idea to check them against each other, and you can do it in maple syrup, or you can do it in a sugar solution, sort of thing. They need to be very close, reading very close to each other. Okay, so here's what I'm referring to on these Hannameters, which is a spectrophotometric piece of equipment. What you have on the front of these meters, these are the Canadian transmission intervals. So we would never get 100% transmission and still be able to call something maple syrup. There's always going to be a little bit color to it. And the grade A light amber goes down to 75% transmission. The medium amber is 60.5 to 74.9, etc. So these are intervals that were actually came from some USDA research back in the 1930s and have been adopted by Canada as the official way to grade syrups. And this is a comparison that Steve and I did of the visual, what was pretty clear early on in the introduction of the Hanna equipment is that the Hanna meters were giving different results than the visual grading references. And so this was actually the trigger for the research that Steve and I did to evaluate the different visual graders and evaluate them against the Hanna analyzers and some other spectrophotometers that we got our hands onto. So we had about, I think, 5 different spectrophotometers and a bunch of different visual graders. And what turned out to be the case is that these, to get syrups classified in the same way that we thought they ought to be according to the visual reference color standards, we had to go to lower transmission values. And that's what we have. Whoops, I'm pointing to my computer here. But in the far right column, the Cornell percent transmission lists the lower transmission. Oh, there you go, Steve. Thank you. I should figure out how to use that. um, the lower transmission values, and you see that in each case they're lower. So what happened is that back when the middle column, Balch was a USDA scientist who tried to develop these transmission standards, and he didn't recognize that the eye was a different piece of equipment than the electronic spectrophotometer and would give different results. So he developed these, and they were adopted by Canada, but they have been proven not just by us, but by people of Vermont to result in a different grading system. Yes. Right. So. Oops. Trying to figure out how to use the pointer here. I don't see the pointer showing up. So, okay, there. Now, can I do this? Okay, there, I can do that. All right, great. So this middle column here is the column that I was referring to that was produced quite a long time ago back by Mr. Balch. All right. So visual grading requires your eyes as the sensor. It requires a color standard, and this can be either liquid, such as the Vermont kit, glass, or plastic. And then it requires a light source. So the visual, and one of the results that Steve and I came up with is that the visual grading kits produce similar results if properly used. And I'll describe what that means. In the next bullet, it means that you use the right container, you use the background color, white is preferable, and you use good white light, either skylight or good quality tungsten bulb to produce the background light color. So sample containers actually turned out to be really important, and you should pay attention to the kind of container that your kit comes with and plan to use that, because the kit was designed around the, let me get my little pointer going here. Oh, there we go. Okay, so the kits were designed around having the light pass through a certain path length of syrup. So you see here, this is from a Lovabond kit. This is for a Hanna meter. This is for a Canadian visual grader. These are the kinds of bottles that are used in the USDA kit and so on. So they each have a defined path length of light through the syrup, and the calibration is done with that particular path length in mind. The Lovabond kit was in fact designed around a path length that was used to develop the USDA standards. So it is in fact the closest path length to what the USDA standards are all about. So you need to use the right kind of container or design for that your kit was designed for. And so here is some of the data results, and I'm sorry about our little graph didn't show up so well. Trying to get the pointer going. Oh, there we go. Okay, so let me just go through this a bit. On the side here, we have light, medium, dark, extra dark, which are the different color grades, and the what we call producer grades in this column are what the syrup was classified by the producer when it was sold to us or given to us. And we found about 85 different syrups that were produced in New York State, around the state, from different sources. And we had coming into the lab 23 syrups that were classified by the producers as light, 45 as medium, 16 as dark. None were extra dark. However, when Steve and I did the evaluations, using, in this case, the several different visual grading kits, the first of which is the USDA kit, we found in all cases that a lot of the lights became mediums, the mediums became dark, and we suddenly found a whole bunch of extra darks. So this suggests, is good evidence that there is a problem in producers achieving the right color grade. And my guess is we haven't actually gone back to figure out where the problem might be, but a lot of it may happen because as I indicated earlier, the color changes with time in the container. So you screw on the cap, you think you have a light syrup, and if it's too close to the line, it will drift into the medium range or from dark to extra dark. So if you go across here from the USDA reference kit to the Vermont kit, Lovabond, the Berliner kit, and a Vermont Grim kit that isn't sold anymore, although there are a number of them around that's a glass-based kit similar to the USDA kit. You see that the actual classifications are not greatly different, but they are different. So using the USDA as a reference standard, you see the Vermont is a little bit different in terms of where these syrups are classified. Lovabond is a little bit different. Berliner's different too. The Berliner differences, it turned out, were a function of our using the wrong container. We had an old kit. It turned out these little glass bottles fit in pretty nicely, and that's what Steve and I used at the outset. We were able to get a hold of the official Berliner container, which had a bigger path length to it. And when we did that, these numbers fell closer into line with these other numbers that you see here. So our conclusion is that for the most part, these visual kits give you the same result irrespective of the kit. And it becomes a matter of availability, convenience, whatever it might be that you may have inherited or are able to buy. Some of these are pretty expensive. Most people use Vermont because it's at the outset pretty cheap, although you're supposed to replace it every year. And over time, that could make it more expensive. So that reflects how these kits compare with each other. And I will also say that if you adjust the transmission values for the Hanna meters, those work perfectly well also. So they give you close enough to the same results that you can substitute one for the other if you make those transmission value adjustments. One other thing that we were interested in, because Steve and I were working together and we weren't always agreeing on all of this, looking at the different conditions that will affect grading. This is one that I think Steve did, grading these syrups on campus, looking out of a window of a laboratory building on campus, classifying the syrup into the different color classes. And then he took them out to the R0 in this rightmost column and did it again. And you know, the lights are the same, but he got a few less mediums and a few more darks and a few more extra darks. So the color quality of the sky can affect, or the color quality of the background, or if you're grading against a fluorescent bulb versus an incandescent bulb, it can make a difference in terms of the color grade that you end up with. And most of these differences are where the syrup is at the margin, the dividing line between, let's say, light and medium. So those are intrinsically much harder to judge. And so this is where the difference of the swing is going to come with a syrup that I might think is light, Steve might see as medium, or vice versa, and the color may have some impact on which side of the line you drop it into. Here's looking at both of us grading the same set of syrups in the same location using the same piece of equipment. Again, there are some slight differences. So this is Steve's judgment and eyes against my judgment and eyes, and maybe how I held the Vermont kit at a certain angle or something of that sort. But you see that two people grading the same syrups with the same equipment can come up with different results. It's something to just be paying attention to. And I would say because most of these problems, or all of these problems, are syrups that are right at the line, and knowing that the syrups will get darker with time, it's probably better to push it, even though you're giving up sort of having a light syrup maybe by pushing it into medium. It might be better to sell it as a medium syrup even if it's close to being a light, because with time it's going to fall into the medium range. The design of these kits will make it easier or harder to make these judgments. And I show here on the bottom is the old USDA kit, which has color glass standards, and you see that they're arranged very close to each other. The new USDA kit with plastic color standards has these compartments much further apart. The closer together makes it easier to make the comparison. So the Vermont kit is much like the new USDA kit in that the colors are spaced pretty far apart, and it's a little harder to judge color comparisons in that case. Here's what, for those of you, a couple of you had a Lovabond kit, I think, but for those of you who don't, this is a very nicely designed piece of equipment. It's structured so that optically the color standard is put right next to the syrup that you have, and so you have no space between them, and it becomes much easier to make a quick judgment about what the color comparison is. Color. So we have a question from Marty about see color-based subjective grading going away. The color grading is not subjective. It's using equipment that's standardized. There's variation, and maybe you'd think about that as subjective, but it really isn't. It's just sort of different, slightly different conditions will produce sort of people making different judgments. But I mean, the IMSI wants to move away from color per se as something on the label and using terms that are more flavor descriptive. So that's something that people clearly have different opinions about. It's been discussed a lot. So I don't think this will be going away anytime soon. And Steve noted here that stratifying a color in a barrel or even a gallon is not uncommon. We have seen syrups brought in to us where we've had a light syrup on top of a dark syrup. It's separated in the container, and consumers have brought this into us. And so it doesn't happen. This separation of color may be in relation to density. Well, it would have to be in relation to density of different syrups, is still a possibility. Okay, the Hanna meters, I've already mentioned that the transmission grades have to be adjusted so that they match the USDA standards. So we have this interesting situation. The Hanna meters serve perfectly well in the Canadian system because the Canadians are using transmission standards as the way they grade color. But you have to do the correction to have it match what the US regulations amount to. One thing I want to have you be very cautious about, and this applies not just to the use of the Hanna meters, but also to the use of the electronic refractometers, that it's seductive to see these nice round numbers appearing boldly on your screen. It seems to make the judgment a lot easier, but there is variation in the readings for these pieces of equipment. There's variation between different meters. Not greatly so, but there is. How you handle the different containers can affect, partly because of the precision of these numbers, you can pick up differences in the way you handle the meters, they handle the samples. There are advantages to using the spectrophotometer or the Hanna meter in that you're not making a human judgment about the color. They tend to be more repeatable. They are more exacting in terms of having a number to place against the color so that you can be a little bit more precise about how close it is to one of these dividing points between the color grades. You can track color changes through time in your syrups. So the ability to quantify color changes can be quite important. The advantages of visual grading, however, are that it's less expensive and the equipment is more robust. Um, the Hanna meters don't stand up to a lot of banging around in a typical sugar house. They have to be treated carefully, and it's best actually if they're done in a temperature-controlled room. You can, with visual equipment, you can determine if there's some other problem with the sample, if there's a lack of clarity, if the color is odd in some way. It is what the customer sees, and of course it is the current U.S. standard, so you are somewhat obliged to use the color standards in the U.S. My admonition again is to do it right. For sure, you need to maintain your equipment, whatever it is. You need to keep your color chips clean, your Vermont bottles clean. You need to replace those kits annually. You should store them properly. That is, they shouldn't be sitting out on a windowsill exposed to light because that'll affect the liquids in the Vermont kit. Use the correct containers. Use white light for visual grading. And that remember that grading close to the line is very difficult and the syrups will darken. So you're probably better off erring on the side of going to the darker end if it is a close decision. If you have to ask somebody else to take a look at this and make a judgment, it's too close to the line. Okay, flavor. Last item here. As I indicated at the outset, flavor is the critical quality that consumers are buying the syrups for. Whether it's light, medium, dark, or whatever it is, they want a good tasting maple syrup. And I think all of us want the same. This is, again, the Ohio meeting out in Ohio where they had a syrup flavor contest. And you have Henry and a couple other people doing a flavor evaluation of all of these syrups. One of the points that I discovered really pretty easily through a series of tests that I did around New York State a year or two ago is that color and flavor really don't match very well. Some earlier work in Quebec demonstrated this using laboratory tasters and trained tasters. But what I did is went around at different maple workshops. Some of these people you recognize. Perhaps this was up in Lewis County. I did it in several different locations around New York and got people to put some graded syrup in these little dark bottles so they couldn't see the color of syrup in the bottle unless they cheated. And a few producers tried their best to look into the bottle and try to guess by visual technique. But the idea was to have them taste the syrup and tell me whether they thought it was a light, medium, or dark syrup in the bottle without being able to visually look at it. So just by taste alone. And I'll show you those results here. So what we have are on the left-hand side the color grades that we apply to these syrups, and then in this column here is the number of people who graded, the percent of people, and I had over 100 people did this. So the percent of people who graded, who thought a light syrup was light on taste alone. So let's say 40% of the producers who tasted these syrups judged a light syrup to be a light syrup, but that means that 60% didn't. And here's how those results laid themselves out. So even though it was definitely a light syrup, 7% of the people said it was B extra dark. And then you can apply a similar test to ask how many people would judge a extra dark syrup as an extra dark syrup. So in this case, 28% of the tasters correctly judged an extra dark syrup to be extra dark. 43% said it was a dark syrup, and 10% said it was a light syrup. Okay, what does this suggest about how closely matched these are? Well, partly it relates to the ability to detect flavor, and I'll say a little bit more about this. Here's another kind of summary. So out of the total population, only or 25% of the tasters got none of the syrups correct. So, a quarter of the people didn't guess right in any case. 47%, however, guessed at least one correctly. 22 guessed two correctly. Nobody got all of them right, all four right. So it suggests that there's a lot of variability in trying to match flavor and color. This, of course, is not what we commonly do. And one of the aspects of all of this that you need to be aware of is that people begin to taste with their eyes. So if they look at a light syrup and they see it's a light syrup, then they're going to think of it as a light syrup when they evaluate the taste. So this is sort of a reverse evaluation, which is not as realistic as what happens. Okay, we have some questions about the effect of RO on flavor. Deal with that. Okay, so the flavor sensing that we have, it's another one of the grading pieces of equipment we carry with us every day. So our flavor sense is our tongue and our nose. And our tongue can detect 5 different flavor elements, and our nose has cells in them that have can detect a lot more flavor compounds. And it's a combination of what our tongue senses and our nose senses that produces our sensation that we're tasting maple syrup. But this is a human-based sensory system that is quite variable. So there are significant differences in ability of people to detect, taste different materials. Some of this relates to the density of our taste buds on our tongue. So we have the tongue of a non-taster with the taste buds highlighted in yellow, right there. This is the density of taste buds of a normal taster, and there are people that have a very high density of taste buds that are known as super tasters. These are generally the professional tasters. That you have to be in this category to be paid to taste things. Although others of us are in that category. Not me, unfortunately. I think I'm probably at this end, and I don't know where you might be, Steve, but in any case, we're all in this range somewhere. So some of us have very good ability to discriminate taste, and some of us are not so good. And you need to be aware of that. It's not just there are gender abilities. Women tend to be better tasters than men. Younger people tend to be better tasters than older people. Things like smoking cigarettes can affect your taste sensitivity, and so on. So there are a variety of things that make the flavor judgments the most problematic of all of the grading steps. So here is what's called a flavor wheel, which for maple products, which was produced by the Center Acer people at Quebec. And it's similar to flavor wheels that you find for wines, you find for olive oils, and there are other products that have produced flavor wheels. What it is a catalog of the different flavor elements that you would find in a maple syrup in this case. So they tend to be grouped, as you see here. So there's a group of flavor compounds that would be thought of as maple. There are sugar or confectionery flavors. There's vanilla. Amphotermatic are the flavors that are produced by the heating of the syrup. So the caramel flavors, the chicory toast flavors. You can't probably read this, but black coffee, chocolate are in this group. And they're in this group because, interestingly enough, the flavors in coffee and chocolate are produced by the same chemicals and the same heating process that we use in producing maple products. So it isn't unreasonable to find these kind of compounds in some maple syrups. They're not as common as some of the other compounds, but we have floral, fruity, spicy. There are two groups here that are foreign. One that represents deterioration products, so fermentation, buddy syrup would fall into these categories here, microbial contamination. And the other group of foreign flavors would be a result of the environment. So putting too much defoamer in the pan, storing syrup or some products in plastics can flavor solvents. Sometimes, well, there can be, if you're using containers that were used for something else and you shouldn't be doing that, you may have flavors leaching into the syrup from what had been in that container before. So the ones you need to be most sensitive to, and generally this requires some experience and training, are these flavors in here. You really don't want these in your syrups. You won't have customers coming back if that happens. It is helpful to evaluate yourself in terms of your ability to test these other flavors. And some of you, I know Chuck does a nice job in helping consumers to understand the flavors within products, within the maple products, and to appreciate the flavors. But get a hold of one of these color wheels and start educating yourself. And one way to do that is similar to what the wine tasters do, and they sit around and they sample different wines and they share ideas and what they're tasting, and they educate each other about how to detect flavors. I think to summarize very quickly here, as we're getting near the end of the time, I wanted to share with you that these grading, how some of these grading tools work, what we're actually after in terms of syrup qualities that we're testing for. We need to understand more about how these pieces of equipment can be used, should be used properly, and how they can be mishandled and misused and maybe not giving you the correct results. And I'd like to leave you with the fact that this flavor aspect of the syrup is something we should be, you should be evaluating for your syrups every time you can a batch of syrup, so that you have something, you have an experience to share with the customers about the quality of the product in the jar. And the flavor profile will change during the season, as I think many of you do know. So let's see, do we have questions that people have at this point? So Wayne has a question about the effect of RO on flavor, and there's work at the University of Vermont that's actually evaluating this. There are good reasons to believe that the RO might affect flavor, because what you're doing is removing much more water, and it then there's less time that the sap sits in the pan getting heated. And that may affect the flavor development. I don't know the results of their studies. Steve may know more about that, but there is a reason to be looking into the impact of use of RO on flavor.
Yeah, basically the results of their studies were that taste panels could not identify where ROs had been used and where they had not. And they tried it at several different levels, at 16 bricks, I believe at 12, at 8, and then standard unconcentrated sap, all from the same source.
Right. So this is another instance where what we think theoretically might be happening really isn't. And certainly I have run into producers who would swear that they don't use an RO because of its impact on flavor. I think we still may be playing with this for a little while, but the Vermont people have a nice setup for doing these kinds of studies, so I'd pay attention to them.
One of the co-op extension people in Quebec that I work with a fair amount, their research sort of indicated that extra high vacuum actually pulled buddy flavors into syrup sooner than where they were operating at 20 inches or less, which I found that research very interesting and would like to see that verified. Um, I think that there was a comment made about whether wood or oil affect flavor, and in my experience, if you are boiling with wood and a fair amount of smoke has access to the surface of your pan, you can get a very smoky flavored syrup. But where pan covers and so on are used, I don't really find that to be the case. RO can affect color both ways. People who run sap through an RO and then let the concentrated sap sit for a while can actually darken their syrup uh, because the bacteria and yeast are not taken out by the RO, and others who process very quickly out of the RO are actually able to get a little lighter syrup in many cases. So it can go both ways. It comes down to sap management.
Yeah, we didn't mention the effect of the aerators, which definitely has an effect on color. And it's sufficiently great that you can get a light syrup that really will taste like a dark syrup. So the bleaching effect of pushing oxygen through the syrup produces a different relationship between color and flavor if you're using an aerator. Um, so what are the penalties for getting the grade wrong? Well, the they're probably not very big. It depends what sort of pride you have in all of this, I suppose. But what the inspector will tell you to do is the easiest thing to do is simply to remove the color from your grading label. So if you've called it a light syrup and is now medium, you simply remove that because you're not required, as I said earlier, you're not required to put a color on the grade. And so that's the easiest solutions. If you're at the grade A, grade B level, you have a little bit more labeling to do. But it's mostly a matter of changing your labels.
Over, you asked the question about it being suspicious that we were so far off from the grades of the producers. And I need to point out that there was a fair amount of time involved for a lot of those samples. It took us over 6 months to collect the number of samples we did voluntarily, and also a number of those samples came from ag and markets. When they buy the syrup, then they were willing to turn those over to us. Those were in process for over a year. So there was some time involved, and I think that more points out that syrup does darken over time. Well, I see that our time actually is gone, and we do ask you to feel free to continue to ask questions here for several minutes. I would like to point out those who didn't get a chance to register yet that you would go ahead and do that. Feel free to still continue to fill in answers on the polls. That's kind of interesting information. I'm
Steve, we've lost you.
going to pull up, sorry about that. I'm putting the exit survey also on the screen so that we'd ask those who have been here for the program if you wouldn't go and answer a few questions on the exit survey. We do appreciate each of you coming and being part of our webinar tonight. And if you're interested in having them continue, put a note to that effect in the chat box as you're leaving. And the other thing I would just sort of want to point out is we do have a whole series of winter schools coming up in many parts of the state, and you can get those by going to the Cornell webpage. We'll also have them up on Maple Trader for those who go to that site. Or if you go right here to the Maple Files, most of that calendar is listed there, and you can download that right to your computer. It's interesting to talk to you and only have you write back, but we do thank you for participating in this, and we look forward to doing these again. Thank Brian for taking the time to do the presentation tonight. So thank you and
Good.
good night.
Enjoyed it. Chuck, my response to your question about steam is that, again, theoretically, the advantages of steam, of course, are you can control the temperatures better than you can do in either wood or oil fire, and you won't get the kind of hot spots necessarily that you'll find in most oil or wood evaporators. So that potentially you could control the flavor development better in a steam system. But I don't know, we're getting pretty good syrups from the equipment we're using now. So I wouldn't switch to steam just for that.